If you're learning a CAD program and you have a set of calipers, you've probably picked up a part and then tried to reverse engineer that part to model it in the CAD program. I'm going to drag the timeline back to the first sketch and we'll make that sketch visible. And the first thing that I notice is a lot of blue geometry. In this color scheme, the blue geometry indicates that the geometry is not fully defined. So the first thing that you should always do is strive to fully define your geometry. I also see a little piece of geometry hanging out in space, and these white dots indicate that they're not fully constrained. Let's go ahead and edit this sketch. So I'm going to do edit sketch, and I see there's a dimension across here of 76. So 76 from the origin or the y-axis over to some point in space. This 76 is not measuring anything. What was the design intent here? If I were measuring the object, it would be real easy to measure from here over to here. So I'm going to assume that that 76 is supposed to be from here to here, which it isn't, but that's what we'll make as our assumption. There's no real point in dimensioning something in space that has no function. Also, I noticed that there is a 35 dimension over here and a 35 dimension over here, a 32 dimension over here and a 32 dimension over here. When we model a symmetrical object in a CAD program, we can use equal constraints to make, for example, this circle equal to that circle, and then if I decide I want to change this, say to 36, I only need to change it one place. I don't need to change it in two places. So I never duplicate any dimensions. We see additional dimensions duplicated here, and actually I just accidentally moved my entire piece of geometry. So we have a lot of symmetry here. I would model with that symmetry about the origin, and then I would fully define everything so that I can't accidentally move something and change the size of something. So my number one rule is to create one line or one circle or one rectangle and dimension it immediately for a sense of scale, and then continue to define your geometry as you go along. Don't wait until you have a complex sketch like this and then attempt to define the geometry. I'm going to do some other measurements here. So there's a lot of missing dimensions. I'm going to dimension this distance from here to here, and I see that that comes off to a strange number that I could not measure with my calipers. But on the real part, it would be real easy to measure this distance from here to here with my calipers. I'll go ahead and accept that, but I'm going to change that. I would expect that to be probably 20 millimeters instead of 19.971158. And with everything that I do, I would use logical dimensions. And I see that this point doesn't line up with the center line of the object, but there are certain things that are relatively easy to measure. For example, the diameter of this is easier to measure. The diameter of this inside circle is easy to measure. And if I go back to show my solid body again, the dimension from here to here is easy to measure. Now, one thing that is difficult to measure is our soles are in space. They're an imaginary location in space. But with my calipers, I can hone down on how to get those dimensions. For example, I can dimension from this point right here to this point, or from this point to this point. Now that'd be slightly difficult to measure with the calipers, but not too difficult. From here to here is pretty easy. From here to here is slightly difficult, but not too difficult. Or from here to this point is fairly easy to measure with the calipers. So I pick locations that are easy to measure with the calipers and get those into my sketch first. I would expect this arc to be tangent to this circle and tangent over here. Now if you want those to that point, and if you want that to that point, that's fine, that's where you can put them, but I'm going to assume that that arc should be tangent over here and it should be tangent over here. So let's look at how I might set this up. So I'm going to go so that I'm looking at XY, and I'm going to change this to my top view so that Z is pointing out of the screen at me, and I'm going to then create a new component. So I have this component active. I'll make the origin visible in this component, and I'm going to start a new sketch on this XY plane. And then I'm going to put a line out in space, and I'm going to dimension that line as the 76. I want the midpoint of this line to be at the origin so that we can model with symmetry. So I'll do midpoint and I'll select that line, I'll select the origin. Notice that that line turns black. It's fully defined. So I draw one line or one circle or one arc or one rectangle, dimension it immediately to give me a sense of scale. Now I want this line actually to be construction, so I'll select that and come over here and click construction. And then I'm going to draw a circle somewhere on this line, but not at the midpoint. I'll draw it over to here and somewhere on this line over to here, and I'll make those two circles equal then. So I'll do equal, that circle is equal to that circle, and I'll dimension one of these circles, and I'm going to dimension that as 35. Notice that my entire sketch turns black. It's all fully defined. I don't have any undefined geometry. And then I'm going to draw a second circle, and I'm going to do that in here, from here to here, and from here to here. I'll do equal, this circle equal to this circle. I'll dimension one of these circles, and I'm going to dimension that one as 32. Notice it turns black. It's all fully defined. I'm then going to draw a line from the origin straight up like that, and I'll draw a second line. I could have done this just as one line, but I'll do that as two separate lines. And I'm going to right click, or I could come over here and I'm going to change that to construction, and I'll right click, I'll change this one to construction. I'll then draw a 2-point rectangle someplace out here in space, and I'll draw another 2-point rectangle someplace out here in space. Let me move that dimension down some. Then I'm going to dimension some dimensions that are easy to measure with my calipers. So with my calipers, it is real easy to dimension this distance from here to here. And we saw earlier that was 19.9711 something or another. I'm going to make that as 20. Now I want this to be centered up with this line of symmetry. So I'm going to do a midpoint between this line and this point. I want this point to be somewhere on this circle. So I'll do coincident this point to the circle. Now, I may be able to measure from here to here with my calipers, or from here to here with my calipers. Now, this will be slightly difficult to measure this, but if you know how to use your calipers, we can probably measure that. I'm going to go ahead and draw a line in here from here to here, and I'll change that line to construction. So I'll right click, change that to construction, and I'm going to assume that I can measure it from here, but you might measure it from here. If I were going to measure it from there, I would go ahead and put a sketch point at that location. So I do the measurement with my calipers, and I measure from here to here, and I get that as a distance of 1 millimeters. Of course, if you measure that and it's actually 1.5, you know, whatever it is, you can edit the sketch to change it to the dimension that it actually is. I'll change this line to construction line. And we drew a rectangle down here. I'm going to do the same thing with this rectangle. So I'll do a midpoint between this point and the line, and then I'm going to dimension using my calipers. I measure this distance across here, and I see that it's 15. And then I measure the distance from here up to here, and I see that that's 44. So I'll dimension that distance as 44. So the dimensions that are really easy to measure, those are the ones that I do first. I said I was going to make the arc from here to here tangent, but if you want to make it to this quadrant, put a construction line in there and go ahead and make it to the quadrant. But I'm going to do an arc, and I'll select this arc over here someplace. I'll do this arc, and I'll just click on the screen someplace to place that, and then I'll do tangent. I want this arc tangent to that arc. I want that arc tangent to this arc. Now I don't know where the center or the radius of this arc is just yet. So right now it's blue. I'm going to make this arc coincident with this corner right here. And before I do that, let's change this to construction line, just like I did up here. And so then I'm going to do coincident this point to the arc. I'm going to draw a second arc in here, and so I'll do another arc, and I'll select this arc, and I'll select this arc, and I'll come in here someplace, and then I'll do tangent between here and here tangent between here, and then I also want those two circles, those two arcs, to be concentric, so I'll set those to be concentric. Now it'd be fairly easy to measure the distance from here up to that point right there. So let's put a point there. So I'll do a sketch point. So with my calipers I can real easily dimension from this arc to this line, and I'm going to put in that dimension. I measure 8 millimeters. So notice now that everything turns black. It's all fully constrained. So as I go along, I strive to fully constrain all of my dimensions so that I don't end up with a big mess that when I start adding dimensions it becomes all convoluted. Now, I don't need to trim off this geometry, but I could trim it if I like. Let's create a little bit more geometry and then I'll trim this up. So I'm going to create a line coming from here. I'll come down here someplace, and then I'm going to come over to this inside arc, and I'll do the same thing on the other side. So I'll come down over to about here, and I'll come over to that inside arc. Now I want this distance from here to here. I can measure that real easy with the calipers. So I measure that distance with the calipers and I get 2.5 millimeters. Now I want these to be symmetrical on either side, so I'll do symmetry. I'll select this line, and then the line of symmetry. And I'll also select this line and the line of symmetry. Now you can hide these constraints if they obscure the too much. Once you know what's happening, you don't really need to see those visible. So a beginner probably wants to show those constraints, but an experienced person knows what Fusion is doing, so they generally will have that unconstrained. All right, and then with the calipers, it's fairly easy to measure the length of this line, and so I'll measure that, and it's 6 millimeters when I measure it with the calipers. Now again, we don't have to do any trimming, but if we would like to, we could do some trimming here. So I'll trim off this portion and trim off this portion. Now sometimes I won't do any trimming if my geometry turns blue. Then I prefer to just leave it like this. So I'll trim this. So again, you don't necessarily have to trim that. We can select the areas that we want. But we see that we have an enclosed area that is, everything has turned black. Now if we wanted to, we could change this to a construction line, put a line over top of here, or we could also, there's a modify break. We could break this line into 2 lines. That I'm just going to leave that the way. Well, let me just show you how to use that break. So I'll do we don't need to do this. We could leave it the way it is, but I'll do the break, and I'll select this line, and notice it's going to break it at that point, and I can also break it at that point. So I'll select that line, and it breaks it at those 2 points. It gives me a warning that I lost a constraint, and notice this has turned blue. I'm going to right click and change that to construction, and then I want to see why this is blue. So I try to drag it, and I see that it's no longer horizontal. So whenever you're not sure about why some geometry is not fully defined, try dragging the endpoints of the lines or the circles, and you should be able to visually see. So I see that I need for that line to be horizontal, and so now it turns black. It's all fully defined again. I could trim this arc here. I may or may not do that, so I'll trim that, and I see that everything turns black. Again, if it turned blue, I would probably just undo that and leave it the way it was. I'll then do my extrusion. So I'll do extrude, and again, I like to do everything with symmetry about the origin. So you could just extrude this in one direction. I'm going to tell it to do symmetric, and I want it to be a total of 15 millimeters, and I'll say okay to that. Alright, then I want to put a slot right here and a slot right here. So I'm going to do a new sketch on this plane. So I always do my sketches on these origin planes rather than on the part face. So it's more robust to do them on the origin planes. So then I'm going to do P for project, and I'm going to project this line right here, and I'll project this line right here into my current sketch, which is on that YZ plane. I'll do a crossing window and change those to construction lines. And then I'll draw a circle at the midpoint of this line, or wherever it is along that line. I'm going to put it at the midpoint, and I'll do that as 3.25 or whatever the diameter is. And then I'll draw a second circle and I'll put that down here, and rather than put a dimension on here, I'll make that equal. This circle is equal to that one, so if I later decide I want to change that, I can change that with one dimension. And then I'll go back to my solid tools and I'll do extrude, and I'll select this circle and I'll select that circle, and I'm going to put it on cut. I'll tell it to go symmetric, and I'll tell it to go through all, so it's going to cut all the way through. Even if I change that width of that part, I ensure that it will go all the way through. So if I turn on the visibility of the sketches and I decide I want to make a change, let's turn on the dimension visibility. And let's say that I decided I want this to be 75. Well, I could just double click on that dimension, change it to 75, and the part will update. If I want this to be 20, I could change that to 20, and the part will update. So any changes that you make are parametrically adjustable. Our sketch is simple. There is no unconstrained geometry. Notice this lock symbol over here. Once the sketch is fully defined, you will get this lock symbol letting you know. So it changes color, changes in this case from blue to black. It puts this lock symbol. So that's parametric modeling in any parametric CAD software.